This is Carrie Johnson with the Iowa Department of Management, and this is part 4 of a brief webinar series to talk about how to administer tax increment financing in the Department of Management valuation system. And so what this segment is particularly going to talk about is the calculation of TIF revenue and how that's reflected in the system and in reports. The other parts of the webinar talked about the background of TIF and a little bit of general information in part 1. Part 2 talked about how you set up the tax districts, the TIF base and TIF increment taxing districts within the valuation system. Part 3 talked about the TIF areas, how those are set up, modified, deleted, etc. in the property valuation system. And this one's going to talk specifically about the calculation of TIF revenue. So to calculate TIF base and increment valuations, because we have to, of course, calculate the valuation before we get to the actual revenue, you're going to use the formula to determine the available budget year TIF base and increment valuations. Keep in mind that utility property should not be included in the calculation of TIF revenue. It's not on the assessment roll and therefore excluded from the calculation. But you're individually going to enter the valuation for each pair of TIF base and TIF increment taxing districts into the formula on the following slide, and then you add them all up to see what the total amount is as far as increments. So you add up all of your individually created increment districts, add them all up, all those that are in the TIF area, to arrive at the total amount of value available for increment within the full TIF area. And again, this would be the maximum amount. In many cases, your TIF authorities aren't necessarily going to be using the maximum amount of TIF available. So as far as the TIF formula goes, column A is always the 100% frozen base valuation. So at the time prior to when the TIF was set up, what was the 100% frozen valuation? Column B is 100% budget year valuation. So say, 5-10 years later, what is the valuation, 100% valuation in this budget year that we're looking at? Column C is the amount of the budget year rollback, so how much of that value is actually being rolled back due to the assessment limitation. Column D is the remaining or the resulting taxable budget year valuation that we're looking at in the year that we're preparing. Column E would then be the amount of that taxable valuation that's going to be in the base district, and column F would be the amount of that valuation that then would be in the increment district. So A minus C is always going to be E. D minus E will then be F. And then just as a note, if A minus C produces a negative amount, then you'd use 0 for column E. So this is really sort of the basics of the TIF formula, right? And I understand that your software is going to do a lot of this work for you, but I do recommend strongly that you take the time to work through the formula yourself with your TIFs and make sure that you understand how it works and that it's also producing the same information that your software is generating. So let's very quickly work through a formula example. Say you have commercial property. You have a TIF. It was commercial property. In the frozen base year, there was a valuation of $100,000, initially, say, way back when this TIF was created, there was $100,000 in frozen base. Now, say 5 years later, there's now $300,000, again, 100% value in this particular TIF. And it's commercial, so there's a 90% rollback. So if we look at A is a frozen base value of 100%, so that's our $100,000. B, what is the value, 100% value now? It's $300,000. C is what is the rollback, so we're looking at a 90% rollback on that $300,000 of value, so the rollback is $30,000. The resulting remaining that's taxable is at $270,000. And then we split that 270 between the base and increment. And so the base gets the 70,000 and the increment gets the 200,000. So really the increment received all of the growth in that property value, and the base received the brunt of the rollback. So it was reduced by the amount of the rollback in that budget year. Formula example 2, same thing, but with residential value. So we're looking at a different kind of rollback, right? So we started out with 100,000 for our frozen base. Say, several years later, it's now worth $200,000 in value in the budget year. And to make it simple for the math, we're going to say 50% rollback. We know it's a little bit more than that, but just for the ease of the math. So we have our 100,000 frozen. Now it's worth 200,000. The amount of the value that's subject to the rollback is 100,000. Remaining is 100,000. So we're saying 50%. So 50% of it is rolled back, leaving 50% of it to be taxed. So that's 100,000. A minus C is going to be E, and that's 0. So the base ate the brunt of the rollback amount, leaving the increment still without $100,000 in increase. So when we talk about the TIF revenue calculation, just keep in mind in general, our tax revenue calculation is the taxable value divided by 1,000 multiplied by the tax rate, right? That's how we get to our tax revenue in general in any case. So the TIF revenue calculation is very similar, but we think of it in that we're looking only at the increment value. That's increments used to generate the TIF revenue, right? The increment valuation is. So the increment valuation divided by 1,000 multiplied by the net consolidated taxing district rate. So it's not the full tax rate that's in that particular area, it's the net consolidated rate. Well, what does that mean? The net consolidated tax rate is our gross consolidated tax rate, but subtracting out any protected levies. So the protected levies are those that are protected in statute from being part of the TIF formula. So they are not going to be diverted for TIF revenue. They stay with the taxing entity that put them in place. So debt service is a protected levy. So if your school has a debt service levy, even on the increment, they're still going to receive the revenue of that debt service levy. It's not going to be diverted to TIF revenue. And also school physical plant and equipment or PEPL and school ISL or instructional support. Those are protected levies, meaning that they're not part of the revenue calculation for TIF. They're not going to go to the TIF authority. It's actually going to stay with the taxing entity itself that set them up. So just as an example, if we look at a particular taxing district, we see our variety of common levy authorities here: county, school, ag extension, assessor, city, community college, the state, brucellosis, and total. And this is our gross consolidated tax rates, just, really round numbers just to be simple. So this is their tax rate minus any debt service levies. So not all these folks can levy for debt service, but in our example here, the county and the school are levying, as well as the city and the community college. So of this total consolidated tax rate, $3.30 are actually not going to go to the TIF. They're going to stay with the county and the school and the city and the college. So they're going to stay there. And then also we look at our school because the PEPL rate and the ISL is protected. So these rates also are going to stay in this case with the school because they're protected. They're not going to be part of that revenue calculation for TIF. So from our gross consolidated tax rate, we subtract off debt service, school, PEPL, and ISL, and this is our net rate for TIF revenue calculation. So some TIF authorities, as I mentioned, do request less than the maximum available TIF tax when they have enough, maybe cash on hand to meet obligations, or perhaps they just, aren't necessarily wanting to capture all of the TIF revenue at one time. They want to spread it out a little bit. When this happens, unneeded TIF increment value must be diverted back to the base valuation at the time that you file your values with me. So the time that you file your values with Department of Management and send them out to the local levy authorities, you must have already known what the TIF authority is intending to do with those TIFs if they're not capturing the full amount of the TIF. And that communication should be happening through the TIF certification process, TIF debt certification process. Keep in mind each year for each TIF area, you're going to be reconciling. So they certify their TIF debt to you and they let you know of any changes each year. And you also reconcile with them the amount of TIF indebtedness. And you're checking to see that the amount of TIF indebtedness that's been previously serviced through increment that's been paid out prior and what's going to be paid out in the current year and the upcoming year. You're reconciling all that with your TIF authority. Because in the end, you want to make sure that there's no more TIF tax paid over to a TIF authority than there is certified TIF debt by TIF area. That's the county auditor's duty, is to make sure that that doesn't happen. So you just want to make sure that that's happening and keep those lines of communication open with your TIF authority and really do it through that TIF debt certification and reconciliation process that you're doing in December prior to finalizing your property values in our system. And there are some reports in our system that you're going to want to be able to use. So in order to run a report that provides for estimated TIF revenue for the TIF areas in your county, current year TIF rates need to be populated in the system, and it should do that for you. If for some reason you didn't see those existing rates populated in there, you can click Populate Rates at the bottom of the screen. And also, you need to enter the TIF rate for any newly created TIF increment districts in this valuation year. So obviously, if you went into the system and you created brand new TIF districts, the system is not going to have any current year rates for those, right? Because they didn't exist in the current year. So you're going to need to manually calculate and enter those rates in the system. So to access the information, you go to TIF area revenue. The screen's going to look like this. It's going to have all of your TIF increment districts in it, and it should list for you all of the different current year rates that are all populated in there. And like I said, if you created something new in this year as you're working in the system won't have a current year rate for it because it didn't exist in the current year. And so you're going to have to manually calculate and enter that rate in there. And the TIF area revenue report looks like this. It's going to have for each of your areas the associated increment districts. It's going to list the taxable increment value, that estimated net consolidated rate, so that TIF rate we were talking about, which is the current year rate minus any debt service and PUPL and ISL. And then it's going to calculate, do the simple math, and list for you the estimated TIF revenue. And again, this is an estimate based on the current rates. It's always important for you and for the TIF authorities to keep in mind that this is truly an estimate. At the time of the calculation of actual TIF revenue, when taxes are certified, this rate very well may be different, right? So this revenue, therefore, may be slightly different. We're using our best guess using the current year rates, what we think that revenue may be. The increment valuation report, similarly, is just going to list just the increment value for each of the areas, the increment districts within those areas. If you have any questions at all about the calculation of TIF revenue, please go ahead and give me a call. Thank you.